History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 2, The Greeks. A military aristocracy's preoccupation with courage may also explain a continuing self assertiveness and independence of the Greek public life. Achilles, as Homer presents him, was as prickly and touchy a fellow as any medieval baron. To this day, a man standing in his peers' eyes is what many Greeks care about. More than anything else, and their politics have often reflected this. It was to prove true during the classical age, when time and time again individualism wrecked the chances of cooperative action. The Greeks were never to produce an enduring empire, for it could only have rested on some measure of subordination of the lesser to the greater good, or some willingness to accept the discipline of routine service. This may have been no bad thing, but meant that for all their Hellenic self consciousness, the Greeks could not unite even their homeland into one state. Below the aristocrats of the early cities were the other ranks of still not very complex society. Free men worked their own land or sometimes for others. Wealth did not change hands rapidly or easily until money made it available in a form more easily transferred than land. Homer measured value in oxen and seems to have envisaged gold and silver as elements in a ritual of gift giving, rather than as means of exchange. This was the background of the later idea that trade and menial tasks were degrading. An aristocratic view lingered on. It helps to explain why in Athens and perhaps elsewhere, commerce was long in the hands of metics, foreign residents who enjoyed no civic privilege, but who provided the services Greek citizens would not provide for themselves. Slavery, of course, was taken for granted, although much uncertainty surrounds the institution. It was clearly capable of many different interpretations. In archaic times, if that is what Homer reflects, most slaves were women, the prizes of victory, but the slaughter of male prisoners later gave way to enslavement. Large scale plantation slavery, such as that of Rome or the European colonies of modern times, was unusual. Many Greeks of the 5th century who were free men owned one or two slaves, and one estimate is that about 1 in 4 of the population was a slave when Athens was most prosperous. They could be freed. One 4th century slave became a considerable banker. They were also often well treated and sometimes loved. One has become famous, Aesop. But they were not free, and the Greeks thought that absolute dependence on another's will was intolerable for a free man, although they hardly ever developed this notion into positive criticism of slavery. It would be anachronistic to be surprised at this. The whole world outside Greece, too, was organized on the assumption that slavery would go on. It was the prevailing social institution almost everywhere, well into the Christian times, and is not yet dead. It is hardly cause for comment. Therefore, the Greeks took it for granted. There was no task that slavery did not sustain for them. From agricultural labor to teaching, our word, pedagogue, originally meant a slave who accompanied a well born boy to school. A famous Greek philosopher later tried to justify this state of affairs by arguing that there were some human beings who were truly intended to be slaves by nature, since they had been given only such faculties as fitted them to serve the purposes of more enlightened men. To modern ears, this does not seem a very impressive argument, but in the context of the way of Greeks and how they thought about nature and man, there was more to it than simple rationalization of prejudice. Slaves may and foreign residents must have been among the many channels by which the Greeks continued to be influenced by the Near East long after civilization had re-emerged in the Aegean. Homer had already mentioned the demiurgoi, foreign craftsmen who must have been brought with them to the cities of the Hellenes. Not only technical skill but the motifs and styles of other lands. In later times, we hear of Greek craftsmen settled in Babylon, and there were many examples of Greek soldiers serving as mercenaries to foreign kings. When the Persians took Egypt in 525 BC, Greeks fought on each side. Some of these men must have returned to the Aegean, bringing with them new ideas and impressions. Meanwhile, there was all the time a continuing commercial and diplomatic intercourse between the Greek cities in Asia and their neighbors. The multiplicity of day-to-day exchanges resulting from the enterprise of the Greeks makes it very hard to distinguish native and foreign contributions to the culture of archaic Greece. One tempting area is art. Here, just as Mycenae had reflected Asian models, so the animal motifs which decorate Greeks' bronze works, or the postures of goddesses such as Aphrodite, recall the art of the Near East. Later, the monumental architecture and statuary of Greece was to imitate Egypt's, and the Egyptian antiquities shaped the styles of the things made by the Greek craftsmen at Naucratis. Although the final product, the mature art of classical Greece, was unique, its roots lie far back in the renewal of ties with Asia in the 8th century. What is not possible to delineate quickly is the slow subsequent irradiation of a process of cultural interplay, which was by the 6th century working both ways, for Greece was by then both pupil and teacher. Lydia, for example, the kingdom of the legendary Croesus, richest man in the world, was Hellenized by its tributary Greek cities. It took its art from them, and probably more important, the alphabet indirectly acquired via Phrygia. Thus, Asia received again what Asia had given. Well before 500 BC, this civilization was so complex that it is easy to lose touch with the exact state of affairs at any one time. By the standards of its contemporaries, early Greece was rapidly changing society, and some of its changes are easier to see than others. One important development toward the end of the 7th century seems to have been a second and more important wave of colonization, often from the eastern Greek cities. Their colonies were a response to agrarian difficulties and population pressure at home. There followed an upsurge of commerce, new economic relationships appearing as trade with the non-Greek world became easier. Part of the evidence is an increased circulation of silver. The Lydians had been the first to strike true coins, tokens of standard weight and imprint. And in the 6th century, money began to be widely used in both foreign and internal trade. Only Sparta resisted its introduction. Specialization became a possible answer to land shortage at home. Athens assured the grain imports she needed by specializing in the output of great quantities of pottery and oil. Chios exported oil and wine. Some Greek cities became notably more dependent on foreign corn, in particular from Egypt or the Greek colonies of the Black Sea. Commercial expansion meant not only that land was no longer the only important source of wealth, but also that more men could buy the land, which was so important in establishing status. This began a revolution both military and political. The old Greek ideal of warfare had been single combat, a form of fighting natural to a society, whose warriors were aristocrats, riding or driving to the field of battle to confront their equals, while less well armed inferiors brawled about them. The new rich could afford the armor and arms which provided a better military instrument. The regiment of hoplites, the heavy armed infantry who were to be for 2 centuries the backbone of Greek armies and give them superiority. They would prevail by disciplined cohesion rather than by individual daring do. The hoplite wore helmet and body armor and carried a shield. His main weapon was the spear, which he did not throw, but with which he thrust and stabbed in the melee, which followed a charge by an ordered formation of spearmen, whose weight gave its effect. Such tactics could work only on relatively level ground, but it was such ground that was usually being contested in Greek wars, for the agriculture on which a Greek city depended could be devastated by seizure of the little plains of the valley floor, where most of its crops were grown. On such terrain, the hoplites would charge as a mass with the aim of sweeping away defenders by their impact. They depended completely on their power to act as a disciplined unit. This both maximized the effect of the charge and enabled them to prevail in the hand to hand fighting which followed. Because each hoplite had to rely for protection on his right hand side by the shield of his neighbor. To keep an ordered line was therefore crucial. The Spartans were in particular admired for their expertise in performing the preliminary evolutions which preceded such an encounter and for retaining cohesion as a group once the scrimmage had begun. The ability to act collectively was the heart of the new warfare. Though bigger numbers now took part in battles, numbers were no longer all that counted. As 3 centuries of Greek success again, Asian armies were to prove. Discipline and tactical skill began to matter more, and they implied some sort of regular training, as well as social widening of the warrior group. More men thus came to share in the power which comes from a near monopoly of the means of exercising force. This was not the only crucial innovation of these years. It was then, too, that the Greeks invented politics, the notion of running collective concerns by discussion of possible choices in a public setting is theirs. The magnitude of what they did lives on in the language we still use, for politics and political are terms derived from Greek word for city, polis. This was the framework of Greek life. It was much more than a mere agglomeration of people living in the same place for economic reasons. That it was more is shown by another Greek turn of speech. They did not speak of Athens doing this or Thebes doing that, but of the Athenians and the Thebans. Bitterly divided though it might often be, the polis, or as for convenience it can be called the city state, was a community, a body of men conscious of shared interests and common goals. Such collective agreement was the essence of the city state. Those who did not like the institutions of the one they lived in could look for alternatives elsewhere. This helped to produce a high degree of cohesiveness but also a narrowness. The Greeks never transcended the passion for local autonomy, another Greek word, and the city state characteristically looked outwards defensively and distrustfully. Gradually, it acquired its protecting gods, its festivals, and its liturgical drama, which connected living men and the past and educated them in the traditions and laws. Thus, it came to be an organism living in the time, spanning generations. But as its roots lay the hoplite ideal of disciplined cooperative action in which men stood shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors, relying on them to support them in the common cause. In early days, the citizen body, those, that is to say, who constituted the politically effective community, was confined to the hoplites, those who could afford to take their place in the ranks on which the defense of the city state depended. It is not surprising that in the later Greek times, reformers who were worried about the results of political extremism would often turn hopefully to the hoplite class when looking for a stable, settled foundation for the polis. At the roots of the city states lay also other facts: geography, economics, kinship. Many of them grew up on very ancient sites, settled in Mycenaean times. Others were newer, but almost always the territory of city state was one of the narrow valleys which could provide just enough for its maintenance. A few were luckier. Sparta sat in a broad valley. A few were specially handicapped. The soil of Attica was poor, and Athens would have been feeding its citizens on imported grain in consequence. Dialect intensified the sense of independence latent in the mountains, separating a city from its neighbors. In it was preserved a sense of common tribal origin which lived on in the great public cults. At the beginning of historical times, these forces had already generated intense feelings of community and individuality, which made it virtually impossible for Greeks to transcend the city state. A few shadowy leagues and confederations did not count for much. Within the city, the involvement of citizens in its life was close. We might find it excessive. Yet, because of its scale, the city state could do without elaborate bureaucracies. The citizen body, always much smaller than the whole population, could always assemble at one meeting place. There was no likelihood that a city state could or would aspire to a minute bureaucratic regulation of affairs. Anything like this would probably have been beyond the capacity of its institutions. If we judge by the evidence of Athens, the state of which we know most because of its recorded history on stone, the distinction between administration, judgment, and lawmaking was not as we know it. As in the Europe of the Middle Ages, an executive act might be clothed as a decision of a court interpreting established law. Law courts were, formally speaking, only sections of the assembly of the citizens. The size and qualification of the membership of this body determined the constitutional character of the state. Upon it depended more or less the authorities of day-to-day government. Whether magistrates or courts, there was nothing like the modern permanent civil service. True, it is still risky to generalize about such matters. There were over 150 city-states, and about many of them we know nothing. Of most of the rest, we know only very little. Obviously, there were important differences between the ways in which they ran their affairs. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle made a great collection of their constitutions, and there would not have been much point in a political scientist doing this unless they were significantly different from one another. But the detail of what went on is hard to discern, even in the few cases where we have good information. As for the history of political forms, the origins are usually buried in legends as informative as the story of Hengist and Horsa to the historian of England. Even Homer is unhelpful about the city-state. He hardly mentions it because his subject is warrior bands. Yet, when the historical age dawns in the city-state, it is there, ruled by aristocracies. The forces which determined the broad lines of its later evolution have already been touched upon. Yet, when the historical age dawns, the city state is there, ruled by aristocracies. The forces which determine the broad lines of its later evolution have already been touched upon. New wealth meant new men, and the new men battered away at the existing elites to get admission to citizenship. The aristocracies, which had supplanted the kings themselves, became objects of rivalry and attack. The new men sought to replace them with governments less respectful of traditional interests. The result was an age of rulers the Greeks called tyrants. They were often moneyed, but their justification was their popularity. They were strong men who set aside the aristocracies. The later sinister connotations of the word tyrant did not then exist. Many tyrants must have seemed benevolent despots. They brought peace after social struggles, probably intensified by a new crisis arising from pressure on land. Peace favored economic growth, as did the usually good relations the tyrants enjoyed with one another. The 7th century was their golden age, yet the institution did not long survive. Few tyrannies lasted 2 generations. In the 6th century, the current turned almost everywhere towards collective government. Oligarchies, constitutional governments, and even incipient democracies began to emerge. Athens was an outstanding example. For a long time, it seems that Attica, though poor, had sufficient land for Athens to escape the social pressures, which in other states led to the colonization movement. In other ways, too, her economy early reflected a special vigor. Even in the 8th century, her pottery suggests that Athens was something of a commercial and artistic leader. In the 6th, though, she too was racked by conflict between rich and poor. A soon legendary lawgiver, Solon, forbade the enslavement of debtors by wealthy creditors, which had the effect of leading men to turn to greater dependence on chattel slaves, since debt bondage could no longer guarantee a labor force. Solon also encouraged farmers to specialize. Oil and wine and their containers became staple Athenian exports, and grain was kept at home. Simultaneously, a series of reforms, also attributed to Solon, gave equality with the old landed class to the newly enriched and provided for a new popular council to prepare business for the ecclesia, the general assembly of all citizens. Such changes did not at once quiet Athens' divisions. An age of tyrants only closed with the expulsion of the last in 510 BC. Then there at last began to operate the institutions whose paradoxical outcome was to be the most important democratic government in Greece, though one over a state which held more slaves than any other. All political decisions were taken in principle by majority vote of the ecclesia, which also elected the important magistrates and military commanders. Ingenious arrangements provided for the organization of the citizens in units which would prevent the emergence of sectional factions representing city dwellers as against farmers or merchants. It was the beginning of a great age, one of prosperity, when Athens would consciously foster festivals and cults looking beyond the city and offered something to all Greeks. This was something of a bid for leadership. Much has been made of the contrast between Athens and its great rival, Sparta. Unlike Athens, Sparta met the pressures upon it not by modifying its institutions but by resisting change. Sparta embodied the most conservative approach to the problem, solving it for a long time by rigid social discipline at home and by conquest among its neighbors, which allowed it to meet the demand for land at others' expense. At very early consequence, was a fossilizing of the social structure. So, tradition bound was Sparta, that it was alleged that its legendary lawgiver, Lycurgus, had even forbidden the writing down of its laws. They were driven home in the minds of the Spartiates by a rigorous training that all underwent in youth, boys and girls alike. Sparta had no tyrants. Its effective government appears to have been shared between a council of old men and five magistrates called Aphos, while the two hereditary kings had special military powers. These oligarchs were, in the last resort, answerable to the assembly of the Spartiates, of whom, according to Herodotus, there were early in the 5th century about 5,000. Sparta was therefore a large aristocracy whose origin, ancient writers agreed, was the hoplite class. Society remained agricultural, no commercial class was allowed to appear, and when the rest of Greece took up the use of money around 600 BC, Sparta stood out and permitted only an iron currency for internal use. Spartiates were not supposed to own silver or gold until the 4th century. Sparta even stood aside from the colonizing movement and launched only one enterprise of this sort. This produced a sort of militarized egalitarianism, often admired by later Puritans, and an atmosphere strongly suggestive for good and ill of the aspirations of an old fashioned and high minded boarding school. Though the passing of time and the position of kings slightly softened their practice, Spartiates knew no great distinctions of wealth or comfort. Until well into classical times, they avoided dressing differently and ate at communal messes. Their conditions of life were, in one word, Spartan, reflecting the idealism and idealization of military virtues and strict discipline. The details are often strikingly unpleasant as well as curious. For the marriage ceremony, for example, the bride's hair was cropped and she was dressed as a boy. This was followed by a simulated rape, after which the couple did not live together, but the man continued to live with his companions in a male dormitory and eat in messes with them. It is interesting that Sparta exported nursemaids to other Greek states. Later, parallels will occur to the reader. It is no artistic or cultural achievement to speak of, and its internal politics remain mysterious. Possibly Spartan politics were simplified or muted by Sparta's gravest problem, the division between the citizen commune and the rest. The bulk of the inhabitants of the Spartan states were not citizens. Some were freemen, most were lots, serf like workers bound to the land, who shared with the free peasants the task of producing the food consumed by the Spartiates' communal meals. Originally, the Helot population may have been the native population enslaved by the Dorian invasions, but they were, like later serfs, tied to the land rather than being the chalets of individual owners. Certainly, their number was later swollen by conquest, above all by the annexation in the 8th century of plain of Messenia, which disappeared from Greek history as an independent state for more than 300 years. As a result, a cloud hung over the Spartan achievement, the fear of a Helot revolt, and it was remarked by other Greeks. It hobbled the Spartans in their relations with other states. Increasingly, they feared to have their army abroad lest its absence should tempt revolt at home. Sparta was always on the alert and feared enemy at home. Sparta and Athens were to quarrel fatally in the 5th century, and this has led them to be seen always as the poles of the political world of ancient Greece. They were not, of course, the only models available, and herein lies one of the secrets of Greek achievement. It would draw upon a richness of political experience and data far greater than anything else seen in the world until this time. This experience would provide the first systematic reflection upon the great problems of the law, duty, and obligation, which have exercised men's mind ever since, largely in terms set by the classical Greeks. In pre classical times, speculations on such themes is almost non existent. The weight of custom and limitations of local experience sufficiently explains this.